Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and to another edition of the Kalb Report, which is co-sponsored by the George Washington University, the National Press Club, and the Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard University. The Kalb Report series is funded by the Knight Foundation. I'm Marvin Kalb, a senior fellow at the Shorenstein Center. Journalism, like any other big business, needs to retool, to retrain its people, to bring them up to speed in an age of instant communication, and at a time when journalists play a very big role in fashioning the public policy of the nation. It's almost impossible these days to imagine an election without television. The good news is a number of journalists are coming up with important plans for retraining the newsrooms of America at this crucial time in American history. The bad news is no one is quite sure who's going to pay for the retraining. Should it be the news organizations themselves or news foundations? And what's been their track record up to this time? We have, in a sense, the perfect panel to address these questions. To my right, Christopher Schroeder, the Chief Executive Officer and the publisher of Washington Post Newsweek Interactive, which is among the top 5 news sites on the web, with more than 5 million unique users. You're going to have to explain to me what unique means. And 170 million page views each month. My left, Caesar Andrews, editor of Gannett News Service here in Washington, providing news copy for Gannett's 94 daily newspapers throughout the U.S. He's also president of the Associated Press Managing Editors Foundation. Again, to my right, Richard Sisk, a reporter in the Washington Bureau of the New York Daily News, who has just finished a training program for reporters who may yet have to cover the war in Iraq. He's a former Marine officer who's covered a number of wars as a reporter. Frank Denton, who is the editor of the Wisconsin State Journal, a reporter since the mid-1960s, currently chair of the Craft Development Committee of the American Association of Newspaper Editors. And Barbara Cochran, president of the Radio Television News Directors Association, which has been in the forefront of training broadcasters for many years. Now, fellow panelists, my opening question is a very easy one. It's like a pitch right across the plate. Why does journalism need additional training at this point? Isn't it enough just to be a good reporter going out to cover a story and doing it well? Start with Schroeder.
Well, I think that being a great reporter and doing great reporting well is imperative even in the new media world. There are 2 particular challenges, one to the newspaper industry and one, I think, to media overall, which the new technology and the internet are bringing to fray right now. The first is what you touched on before, which is the immediacy. Now, newspapers and news magazines, for that matter, can't wait 24 hours necessarily, let alone 5 days necessarily to publish a story. They've got to publish at the same speed as CNN or MSNBC. It's just simply the nature of what the medium is now. And we need to find a way to become more of a breaking culture while at the same time not compromising our very strong belief that we have to be right, we have to be accurate in the story. Secondly, and if you remember me for nothing else, remember me for this. The internet media is and will progressively become more so a multimedia medium. And I don't mean this in some cliched way. This isn't there's video over here and photographs over here and text over here. Now with broadband on an internet site, you can tell the story holistically in all media at the same time concurrently. That changes the dynamic significantly, and it changes the kind of musculature the journalists will need and their supports and the internet sites will need overall. Thank you, Chris.
Caesar Andrews.
I want to try to answer from the perspective of readers. I agree with all the points made. I think if the media were perceived as being high quality, with high standards, delivering the kind of news that readers wanted and needed, if there was a high level of appreciation for what we did, if satisfaction were extremely high, and in the case of newspapers, they were beating down the door to get at those newspapers right as they were coming across the press, then I would say you'd have no need for training. The fact is they're not satisfied. They are, in many cases, dissatisfied. The fact is they don't perceive us as being of high quality in as many ways as we should be. The fact is, in so many instances, there is a disconnect between what we do and attempt to do and how readers or the audience, including viewers, receive us. So I think part of the motivation for more training, more professional development, from my view, is this issue of quality journalism. How do you achieve the highest possible quality? Are we there yet? No, we are not. Therefore, training is one of the things that's needed to get us closer to being there.
How do you define training? What do you mean by that?
Sometimes I wonder myself, it gets kicked around so often. In the sense that I think of it, it is almost anything that relates to making the journalism better. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's a traditional forum, it's a workshop or a seminar. Sometimes it's the one-on-one kind of interaction that goes on every day inside good newsrooms that's probably never called training. It can happen story by story or project by project, but it's anything that in the end helps to improve the journalism.
Excellent. Richard Sisk, you have just come back, and you're even wounded. You've just come back from an 8-day training exercise. You had 57 other colleagues there, mm-hmm. journalists. Tell us about that particular kind of training.
Initial response to your general question about training is, I just don't know. I'm not quite sure, as Mr. Andrews said, what we're talking about here in training. I can make the case for ignorance, I really can. I like the idea of being a general assignment reporter, the idea of training in whatever speciality you want to talk about, other than the technology that is necessary. Do you know how to use a sat phone out in the field from somewhere? I don't. You know, and you grab TV guys or somebody like that, and you know, but really, you know, it might be nice to have a training session in that. But if we're going to be talking about training in specifics, training in the law, training in economics, training in something else, do you really have to be a center fielder to write about what a center fielder does? I don't know. It used to be, and I think the best way still is, training by osmosis. How do you cover the cops? You hang around with people who do cover the cops. You watch what they do. You look for angles and sidelines that might improve on that, and that's the way you do it. The idea of learning languages, well, who could argue with that? But is it something that has to be set aside to take us out of our main mission, which is meeting daily deadlines? I just don't know, and whether a particular organization has the finances and the resources to do that. It's a luxury.
No, but you've just come back from a special kind of training that theoretically would train you to cover a war such as one that might happen in Iraq. Mm-hmm. Do you feel, first of all, what did you do there? What did they train you to do?
It was...
did you learn anything? Was there anything new?
No. But it was something that the military has decided upon. This is I'm taking speculation way beyond the pale here. There's some kind of a gap that's grown between the military and us since Vietnam. There's a tremendous amount of suspicion in the military, maybe for good reasons, maybe for bad reasons, about what we do and what our mission is. One of the big things that has been lacking is us being with particular units, Army, Navy, Marines. Mm-hmm. What is their story? What are they doing? What are those PFCs about? What are they thinking? What are they eating? How do they operate? It's really been lacking. And this was some kind of an attempt by the Pentagon, whether they follow through with it or not, if something happens in Iraq, I do not know. But to try to close that gap, to familiarize us with them, and really, I think more importantly, to let the troops familiarize themselves with us and not be so suspicious of us.
I want to get back to this, but a final question on this round. Do you feel that it was worthwhile for you to spend the 8 days with this group?
Oh, sure. I had a ball before this happened.
Okay, good. Frank, try to answer my question about the need for additional training and be specific in the kind of training.
Well,
we need more training, journalists do, because everyone needs training. Adults continue to learn throughout their lives. We find that out. Teachers, other people who deal in intellectual areas as journalists do, need training because as they grow and deal with more complicated issues, they simply need to know more. But particularly as journalists, the world is becoming a more complicated place. We're dealing with issues that we never thought we would when we first, some of us at my age, came into journalism. So we need to learn new techniques for dealing with it, such as civic journalism and dealing with credibility issues, investigative reporting, computer-aided reporting, all of the things that are kind of relatively new techniques that we're developing. And we're covering new issues across media, as was pointed out earlier. But there really is, the way that I look at it, three kinds of training. One is we hope that we get a journalist out of school with a good, broad, general education. But then he or she needs skills training, which is reporting and writing and interviewing, photography, computer graphics, and some of the other design and some of the other skills that journalists use in the newspaper. After that is training for a specific assignment, which might be, well, for example, I think a lot more journalists are a lot more sophisticated about religion after September 11th because most Americans didn't know anything about Islam or very little about it. So journalists were the ones who had to go out and learn about it so that we could write about it, and many journalists did quickly after September 11th. So the second kind is sort of learning about issues and about movements and kind of larger things going on out there. And then finally is what's really education, and because it's broader than that. It's not as specifically focused, but it's general education so that journalists can go out and deal with a more complicated world and intelligently and thoughtfully, and then be able to translate it to our readers or viewers. So I look at training by degrees of specificity and purpose that way.
So that years ago, if somebody was being sent to Moscow or to China, and the news organization would peel them off and send them for a year of language training, so that when they arrived in these exotic countries, they would be able to speak the language. That is what you're talking about now?
That's one of them. That would probably be the second level that I talked about.
Right.
Because if you didn't do that, when the journalist got there, he or she wouldn't be able to speak the language, wouldn't know the history and culture, would be so far behind that he or she'd never catch up in their reporting. And so the year was probably very well invested because immediately they could hit the ground running and report more intelligently on the subject they were covering.
Barbara Cochran, RTNDA, it has been working in the area of training for a long time. Is there some new angle that you're working on? More training? What's going on at RTNDA?
As Frank said, the world has become more complicated, and some of what we do involves brushing up on skills. I mean, everybody can use a little work on their writing, I think, or their presentation skills, their producing skills in television. Secondly, learning more about a specific topic. I mean, we put on a program last fall in November to give people in our membership base information about bioterrorism, to let them hear firsthand from experts who were looking at the subject. And this, this conference took place about 2 weeks after the anthrax began arriving in the mail at various news organizations. So it was very timely, but not something that we might have been able to get so much interest in, 2 or 3 years previous to that. But I think there's also another purpose that that training or professional development can play. Caesar spoke about the readers, and certainly the public that receives or that is the focus of journalism is extremely important. That's why we exist. But for the people who work within journalism, these have been very tough times. The fact that the public doubts our credibility, the fact that budgets have been cut, the fact that people are being asked to do more with less, to work harder, and the fact that they are now being asked to master new technologies that they never studied when they were in journalism school, if in fact they did go to journalism school. Folks working in journalism are under stress. And so one of the benefits of investing in professional development is that it is a way for our journalism, our companies that practice journalism, to tell the people working in the field that they believe in them, that they care about them, that they are valuable. It's important to invest in a new camera system or digital television in our business, new equipment in a newspaper newsroom, but we also need to invest in the people, and training is the expression of how companies say, we care about you and we think you're valuable.
Forgive me, but that sounds like, you know, touchy-feely. I mean, somebody's going to come around and say, Frank, you're really a terrific guy. Barbara, you're wonderful. Does that mean you're better trained? Does that mean you're going to be a better journalist?
No, but
I'm a little puzzled.
But by sending people to, you know, just even to spend a day, a Saturday, talking to peers, listening to experts, becoming inspired again about the craft that you practice is a very valuable experience for journalists. It's not touchy-feely, it's very practical, but it has that added bonus that it makes people feel valuable again.
I would underscore that point. I think, I mean, most of the time when I talk about training, I speak of it in very general terms about this program or that program. But ultimately, it really does, Barbara is right, it really does boil down to what an individual sees and feels. And perhaps there's a touchy-feely aspect of it, but in an era where some of the traditional loyalty has evaporated, people need other signs that somebody either knows about their skills or talents and is willing to invest in it. And training is just one of the tools that I think smart newsrooms use to do that. Not the general statements about overall training for a news organization, a company, or the industry, but what will this mean to me? And I think to send people to different training programs and to provide different training experiences does make a very individual statement. In addition to doing all the other kinds of things that deal with skills and the fact that the world is changing and so forth, it says something to that individual. Now, the individual has to determine what it really means to him or her. I can't state that because it's so specific to that person. But I think it actually does mean an awful lot when you're willing to tell someone, I'm willing to make this investment in your performance and in your future. I think it does communicate a certain message to the individual.
Those are wonderful words, Caesar, wonderful words. How much is Gannett setting aside for this kind of training? 5% of the payroll, 20% of the payroll? It sounds terribly important. Is this backed up by the organization itself?
It is.
And I'm not picking on Gannett. I mean, it goes to all of you.
I think you just did.
Go ahead.
And I appreciate it.
I'll get to you in a minute.
And Gannett is certainly used to being picked on. I don't know what the figure for Gannett is. I would be surprised if it's past the single digits because that's sort of the nature of this industry, unfortunately. I do know that it provides an awful lot across the company. In fact, in my view, and I've been with Gannett 23 years, it provides more training than ever before. So I think it would be a case of a company on the right track, as I believe the industry is. But I would not begin to say that even Gannett does enough. It does not. It absolutely does not, and even it needs to do more.
Mm-hmm. New York Daily News.
Yep.
Did the Pentagon pay for your 8 days?
Yeah.
They did?
Yeah, with the exception, they paid for everybody's.
Okay, but...
Exception, you know, transportation, room,
But
board,
transportation, the Daily News paid for. And the Daily News paid your salary for that week when you weren't producing stories for them.
They paid for the subway ride over the Pentagon where they picked us up. No, they flew us. They flew us down to Norfolk, and then you know they took us everywhere we were going after that. And did we pay? Yeah, we did pay for meals.
What I'm getting at, Richard, is what is your sense? Have you any idea how much the New York Daily News is setting aside for journalism training?
If it were to be something else, a lot of people. I got a thing the other day. I don't know who these people are. This is some outfit in London, And, you know, there's a brochure here of, you know, people slithering around like Sergeant Rock or something like this. And this is some kind of security firm in Britain that advertises itself as training journalists for hostile regions. $3,000 for a 5-day course. Is my newspaper going to send me to that? No. These guys even say that they will accompany you to wherever you're going. And do what? I don't know. Be your bodyguard? Do you really want that? Is somebody actually doing this? I don't know. There's a similar outfit here in the States. I think it's called Crucible, which also does things like this. And I guess they show you defensive driving or what, you know, how to put a flak jacket on or something like that. But you know, is that worthwhile? You know, your organization is going to invest $3,000 a pop to do something like this, and do you really get anything out of it?
Well,
I don't know.
Before you said that you did get it, that it was a positive experience for you.
Oh, with the Marines?
Yeah, this 8-day
Sure.
stint.
Yeah, but again, I'm conflicted about it because there's two things going on here. Well, A, I got a couple of stories out of it. They took us out on the aircraft carrier, and this was the carrier, the Truman, which just headed off to the Gulf. So, you know, you talk to the captain and so on, and here are these guys going off. So that's one thing. You get a couple of stories out of it. The other part is you're looking for, and you know, I'd like to ask the others about the training. Is one goal of whatever kind of training reporters are going to go through, aren't we also talking about access here? Because that was the whole point of the 58 of us going off on this thing. The idea of making the military feel more comfortable with us, having us around, so that if this thing happens, you go off with a battalion, a company, whatever, and there you are, and you know, you can write about that company. You know, isn't that a lot of what we're talking about here is access, being able to master the jargon of law or economics or something like that, so that when you make the phone call, that particular person you're trying to talk to on deadline will talk to you.
Well, and one hopes that that person would talk to you even if you didn't go on this 8-day journey. Mm-hmm. Chris, Caesar was not able to be specific about Gannett, but you're the CEO, so you can be specific.
Yes, but I won't. But I'll try.
What percentage of the payroll are you setting aside to train your reporters and editors?
Remember, in the .com world, we have producers more than we do journalists. I do have about a dozen or so folks who are actually going out and doing unique reporting, but much of what I do is literally the production of what we have. So the skills and the necessities of the skills are a little bit different than some of the folks that...
You don't regard the producers working for you as journalists?
I regard them completely as journalists, but a little bit different than the kind of journalism that... These folks are not, just to make the distinction clear, these are folks who are not going out and doing the reporting in the classic sense. For the most part, there are some people that do it in that regard. I mean, I'll give you two observations, though, on the budget perspective right now. Actively, we have tried to be very aggressive in our budgeting in excess of 5% in terms of the training. But if I have to be completely candid with you, I will also tell you that in a tough economy, it is probably the first thing to go. And that's just the reality of the world that we have right now. I agree with everything that you say in terms of importance, yet when the rubber hits the road in a year when things are not going as well as you want to because of the economics overall, it's a place where you have to say this is something we can do maybe next year.
Thank you, Chris. Frank, please go ahead, then I have a question for you also.
Build on what he said, which is ASNE, the American Society of Newspaper Editors, we're doing a book on newsroom training and development. And what we're finding is that most American newspapers really don't have a budget for training because most American newspapers are very small. Newspapers my size and larger tend to have a budget. We don't know how much to budget because there's really no model for it, which we're trying to develop in this book. But traditionally what happens is that we will make up some number and get the publisher to agree with it because everybody knows training is important, right? We put it in the budget, and then when advertising revenues fall off, it's the first thing that's cut. So training, get your training early in the fiscal year if you can, because later in the fiscal year it may not be there. But there are two costs to training. One is dollars, and the newspaper industry is very bad about investing in training. 5% would be lavish for any newspaper that I know of, 5% of payroll. I think it's much smaller. But that's a dollar issue. The other issue that is almost as important, and it may be as important in some organizations, is time. The problem with money is with publishers and owners. The problem with time is between editors and reporters, or the person who needs to get the training, because an editor says, I can't spare you.
Exactly.
We had one anecdote. We had a training program at my newspaper for investigative reporters and editors, and it was on computer-aided investigative reporting. And we had maybe a couple of hundred journalists from the upper Midwest come to Madison for this training that was conducted by people from OURI, including one or two people from my newsroom who are expert in this. And I welcomed them, and we asked them, they crowded into our auditorium in our newspaper, we asked them, how many of you were here on your own time? It was on a Saturday because we knew that's when many of them could come. And many of them, I think maybe as many as half, raised their hand that they were on their own time. Mm. And then we asked how many of them were on their own dollar, and about as many raised their hand for that. And it was frankly heartrending for somebody who spent his career in journalism to see these people, a lot of them from small dailies, coming from Minnesota and Iowa, getting 4 of them in a car and getting one cheap hotel room to crash together so that they could come and learn how to be better reporters, to go back and do great journalism. And of course, their owners are doing quite well. The profit margins of newspapers in this country remain extremely strong, somewhere between strong and unmentionable.
Like 20 to 30% a year?
Oh, commonly, and more.
And radio and television as high as 40%,
50.
50%? So we're not talking about organizations that are absolutely strapped.
No.
Okay, please continue.
We're talking about organizations that aren't used to investing in it and don't see the ROI, the return on investment. And it is hard to prove, it's hard to show. But a lot of journalists get training on their own. And there's a survey that's just been done, funded by the Knight organization that Barbara's holding up. And the major finding of that is that the biggest complaint that journalists have about their working situation is not salary. It's lack of training. Salary and working conditions are after that. Journalists want and need and demand training beyond all else, and it's one of the hardest things to get because of time and money.
You know, in preparation for this panel, I was told that the average American company sets aside, check me on this, Chris, 2% of payroll for training, and that news organizations come in at about half that. So it is indeed the single digit that you referred to before, Caesar, but it's not 9, it's closer to 1 in terms of the percent of payroll that will be set aside. So we're talking about wealthy organizations that either, from your point, they haven't been educated as yet. How do you persuade people? I mean, if this training, Barbara, is so important, how do you persuade them to put the money in?
I think one of the things that you have to do is to make the case that training does aid the bottom line. Training is key in retention of employees. And if you can persuade the publisher or the higher-ups that what you are having to spend in order to replace people after they get to a certain level and get kind of fed up and burned out and decide they're going to go try their hand in some other line of work, if you can make the case that that is too great an expense and that a much lower expense of paying for professional development would stop this brain drain, I think you could make a very good case. It's extremely important on the issue of diversity. I mean, American newspapers have a very bad record in terms of attracting a diverse workforce. And part of that problem is that even though they may recruit new people who bring diversity to the newsroom, they're losing people who are leaving the newsroom just as fast. Radio and television has done a little better, but it's not a perfect record by any means. And one of the ways that we understand that you can help to retain and attract minority candidates, both for the regular journalism job and for management, is to give them some professional development, which also helps them in terms of the eyes of their peers when they come back and try to assume a management position or a higher level position.
Caesar, is there any, so far as you know, is there any track record that would suggest that the training actually produces better journalism?
I don't know of anything that would say it in a definitive way. I think it certainly speaks to a great degree of common sense, that exposure to topics certainly can be helpful in the process of doing your job. I want to pick up on the diversity issue as one example of that. If you take journalism as we have known it over the decades, and as people inside newsrooms define what news is and what stories are worth pursuing, it is very clear that over the history of this country and the history of this industry, that certain groups and classes and segments of the community have been left out, ignored, or improperly portrayed. How do you go about improving that picture? How do you make sure that journalism reflects its claim that it covers all of the communities? And I think one of the burdens that we have is when we talk about the purpose and the mission of our news organizations, we tend to talk about them in sweeping terms. And the fact is, we seldom have the resources to back up those claims. Even the simple claim of we cover the community. Well, actually, we have never covered the community in whole. We have covered the parts of the community that we related to and were aware of. And there were entire segments that went uncovered. Well, how do you close that gap? And perhaps in certain eras, this was more of an academic discussion about justice, about completeness, about balance. Well, it has actually become an economic issue, in part because of the demographic trends, which is to say the population is changing. And there's a fundamental thing about readers, I believe. They read what they relate to and what they respect. And all things being equal, the absence of certain groups from the media is a turnoff to significant portions of the population. And forget about the sociology of it if you want to, and forget about the heartfelt pleas for reflecting the community. And just talk about who the readers are. Talk about the numbers. Talk about market share. Talk about readership. Talk about subscriptions. And ultimately, talk about advertising rates.
Gotcha.
So on some level, somebody has to figure out ways to close that gap. And it's not just diversity. It's a bunch of other topics. Business would fall into this category. I wonder about the reality of covering Enron, for example, and the level of knowledge in general, the collective knowledge inside newsrooms of business issues.
Yeah.
And what happens if there's a different level of training that allows a greater level of understanding and a greater level of sophistication, understanding a whole range of topics. So
okay.
I think on that level it does affect quality.
Now,
can I quantify it? Probably not.
Now, I'm trying to understand how the training helps achieve what you've just very eloquently laid out. Maybe it does, but I can imagine as well that if the boss of the news organization, the chief editor, however that be defined, if he or she said, this is the story I want, go out and get it. The reporter, wants to keep the job, is going to go out and get the story. It's not, it seems to me anyway, it's not really training that is going to achieve what you have just laid out.
Except
there's leadership involved.
Leadership, absolutely. In fact,
and to make it comfortable for the person to go out and get that kind of story, to know that that kind of story will be acceptable, do it. Now, that's not the same thing as training at all.
here's where the training comes into play. A visionary or just smart or just responsible leader can say, go cover this story, though I tend to think the better ideas come from all over, not just from the leader, though I tend to like my ideas and hope that a reporter will take them and cover them. So you assign the story. How do you write that story? What are the issues that are important in crafting that story? And if you don't have some sort of cultural reference that allows you to know what those things are, you're a fish out of water in some regards. Now, I do believe a good reporter is a good reporter, can cover any number of things on a very basic level. I think part of what we're saying is that basic isn't good enough, though.
Okay.
That it's not good enough to do a superficial story, that there has to be some understanding of nuance within that community. Who speaks Spanish on the staff? If you happen to be in a community where there's a significant number of Spanish-speaking people, who understands that language? There's another part of it that probably isn't so much training, but that gets at the reality of the whole issue. How the audience receives us is very important, and one of the reasons that you want to have a diverse mix of people. But I think the training is actually a tangible issue in the kinds of things that we talked about, the how to go about defining what news is. How do you write that story? What are the issues that you hear in the community that you can reflect in that story?
Chris, help me with this point. Everybody who has studied journalism in recent years knows that there have been two very large forces at work here, and one of them is consolidation, the idea that there are many different news organizations and then coming together under one kind of leadership, and then convergence, which is your kind of work, where this collision of the old media and the new media. In that environment, what I read about anyway is that in this collision, there are buyouts and layoffs, things that Barbara was talking about before, that people are fired, and this by news organizations that are making an awful lot of money. How do you justify, I'm using you here as a symbol of big power, CEO power. How do you justify laying off, firing, buying out people, producing rather dismal standards of enthusiasm in newsrooms that I've come upon, at the same time as you're making so much money? How do you do both and shave in the morning?
It's interesting because I think there are a lot of companies, and the profit margins that people talk about in broadcast before taxes and everything else have been pretty good in a lot of areas. I don't think anyone that I would ever find from Wall Street to the business world would say that the media industries are fast-growing industries with great profit potential in the future. And in fact, if you talk about the newspaper industry, generally speaking, overall, news magazines in particular, right now, the pressure on circulation growth and revenue growth on an ongoing basis is extremely, extremely difficult. And the costs that are embedded in them are becoming very, very great as well. I think there's a balance has to be done between the amount that folks are investing to do what they can to protect the quality of the journalism that they do now and still have a profit margin which is satisfactory.
Yeah, but how do you establish that profit margin that you consider satisfactory in the current economic environment?
Well, I think right now, me personally, I'm a nonprofit organization, okay? I'm like most of the internet news and information services right now who are very much on a path to profitability. I think that we're going to be there, and in fact, very, very short order. In fact, some of our other comrades are becoming that right now. So in my own particular case, every dollar I spend, I have to be very smart and thoughtful about to make sure that I'm protecting the quality of journalism that we're having going forward basis, but also get us on that path where I think we're going to be, where the trends of the industry are taking for us. Now, in terms of historic parameters of what are the right profit margins in other companies, I cannot tell you, but what I can tell you is that the competition now for people's time is so great. Folks, consumers, you people who read and watch and whatever, are going to so many different places and so many different areas right now that the pressure is incredibly significant on all media companies to be able to withstand some sense of profitability. The big question that companies are asking...
You know, what you're saying is so different from what Frank was saying before and what Barbara was confirming
before. Yeah, I
before.
have to say I look at it, I think, a little bit differently than they do now.
Is that simply because you're from the dot-com world?
No, I don't think it's only just that I'm from the dot-com world. I think right now there's a very big question looming over a lot of traditional media companies, which is we've all been through this recession in the advertising world, a recession that some people say is the worst recession in 50 years. I can't document that or whether or not that's true now. The big question that traditional media companies are going to have is when the economy turns, and it will turn, will the dollars come back? I'll tell you right now, in the newspaper business, it is as good or better to find a job, buy a car, look for a place to live online as it is in a newspaper. And that means for the first time, there are going to be a lot of people who are going somewhere else for their experience to do these things. Now, any quality newspaper on the planet has somewhere between 20 or 40% of their revenue stream tied to jobs, cars, and real estate. That is a real challenge looking forward about where that revenue is going to be on an ongoing basis. Maybe it will come back. Maybe it won't come back. But the fact is we're facing now unprecedented challenges by the changes which are going on out there, which are putting tremendous pressure on all media companies in terms of their potentials for profits, not only today, but as the economy comes back.
Thank you, Chris, for that explanation. I appreciate that. How do we, in that economic war that you're all describing here, how is one to feel good about establishing or reestablishing editorial quality? I mean, the kind of things you were talking about before, Cesar. First-rate editorial quality. How, in the current environment, Barbara and Frank, can you reach out and be comfortable about getting editorial quality, first-class editorial quality, in this current environment?
Well, I think, again, it's an economic imperative, because if you aren't offering a product that your audience values, they're going to go somewhere else, and
Well,
they have
maybe they don't value top quality.
But I don't think that's...
No, I'm asking.
First of all, I think different people are going to define quality differently. Some people want quick, fast, tell me everything important that happened in a very brief period of time, and other people are going to want an in-depth analysis and are going to look for that. So there's room for a lot of different kinds of presentation of journalism. But again, if you're not offering it, somebody else out there is going to be. And you know, thanks to the internet now, quality news is ubiquitous. If I want to, I can go online and read the London Times and get a completely different take on the news than I might get from.
You think the London Times a quality newspaper?
The newspaper. Well, you know, we'll get into that debate some other time.
Frank?
I think newspapers, on average, in fact, almost universally, are better than ever. I really believe that. My newspaper is better than it's been in its 163-year history on this day. And I think the Washington Post is better than it's probably ever been, and I know the New York Times is. I think it's true for most American newspapers that they're better than ever, but Chris laid it out very, very well, that we're in a struggle for people's time, and we're finding that in our Sunday papers that have always been such blockbusters that aren't as much anymore, and we're having to reinvent them. That's what we're doing at my newspaper right now, because we're fighting. We don't have other competitors. The internet's not a competitor of ours. If it hurts anybody, it hurts television viewing. Television is not a competitor of ours. There aren't other newspapers. Our competitor is people's time and interest, mainly time. That it takes time to read a newspaper. It takes time to use the internet.
Are you confident that in 10 to 15 years there will still be your paper?
You know, 5 or 10 years ago, I wasn't so sure, but I am now. Absolutely. Our newspaper and most newspapers are very strong financially. It doesn't mean that we're going to get all of that employment classified advertising back, but there are lots of other ways to do it, including our own websites. I mean, Chris works for the Washington Post website. We're working.
Do you
with
expect your
stations.
website to begin to make money, as Chris was suggesting?
Well, ours is a bit different. I think ours does, but we don't invest an awful lot in it. We don't have a full editorial staff. Ours is an adjunct of the newspaper. So if you look at the P&L, there's a little P in there, but it's not because there's been a great investment in it. It's because we're trying to play it smartly. Some newspapers and other organizations that have invested a lot of money and people and time and their websites have later laid off a lot of those people because it hasn't had the payback that a lot of visionaries, supposed visionaries, thought 5 or 6 years ago thought that they would.
Chris, are you losing $30 million a year?
No, we don't go public with what we lose right now in this regard. We're losing.
You don't want to answer that question?
No, I can't, and we don't as part of the way that we do our reporting right now. No, it's not right. No. And
what is right?
What? I can tell you, no denial. It's not right. It's not like that. And in fact, we're on a very good path, as most of the major quality sites are, because I think the audience proposition is becoming so large now that these things are off into a different world. But I want to touch on something that you said before, and it wraps a little bit in what you said before. I mean, the internet does a lot of things. The internet makes news and information at your fingertips one click away. You can go to the Washington Post, you can go to the New York Times, you can go to Newsweek. That's all well and good. Unlike any way you could do it before. It's one click away. It's right at your fingertips. You can bounce. But what's even more powerful, and in some respects has bigger ramifications for what all media, traditional media companies are facing right now, is what I refer to as a disaggregation of competition. I'm not just worried about people going from WashingtonPost.com to Newsweek or to CNN. When people are interested in sports, I want them to come read the Redskins to me, but now I know they may go to ESPN. If I want them to think about a job, I want them to come to me, but I know they'll go to Monster and Hot Jobs as well. If I want people to talk about politics or think about politics, I know they'll not just go to me, but they'll go to a host of party sites and Rush Limbaugh sites or Rush Limbaugh other kinds of things out there, which may or may not be news. But the fact is, to the point you and I were making before, there are 24 hours a day, and people will go to other different places as well. This puts tremendous amount of pressure on great news sites who think of themselves as one product in a world which, by definition of the technology, it gets disaggregated. To the question you said before, because the response I often get to this is, therefore, Chris, news has become a commodity. And I think here's the other interesting thing about the internet. The internet has also confirmed that trust matters a great deal. For all the ability to spin off in 20 different places at one time, the fact of the matter is a great cacophony is built in that too. And in that cacophony, trust matters. And in the end, people know that if they go to Washington Post or to New York Times or to your organizations, they are in a reliable place. They know they're in a place that they can stay, they can get deep into, they can interact with, they can view in different ways, and they know what they're getting is reliable. And there, I think, is where the quality of journalism matters. I agree completely with a wonderful book I all hope that you read that Len Downey and Bob Kaiser just wrote about where the future of news is going, generally speaking. I believe in the way that I've just described it. Great news, great journalism, and the trust that comes with that, in fact, is what will make this a great business overarchingly over time.
Okay, thank you, Chris.
Chris just made the point I was thinking very well that has to do with the credibility issue. And given all the competition, given the millions of websites that are out there and the ease at which anyone can start up at least a website, the thing that will attract readers and viewers and keep them coming back is credibility. And to that end, I'm involved in APME. You referred to the foundation earlier. One of the key training projects that APME has had in the past 2 years has to do with building credibility in the community, has to do with training, or at least exposing people inside newsrooms to a different way of thinking. I mean, part of the process are the skills kinds of areas that Frank and others have discussed. How do you improve the writing and the picture taking and the design of the page? How do you become a specialist in certain categories, be it business or the minority community or whatever the case may be? There's also a need for elevated thinking inside newsrooms, and that's as important as anything else that I can think of as it relates to all of these kinds of issues. What does that mean? Well, it means thinking through ethics, not just in terms of the rules that are written. Newsrooms are very situational. We all do the best we can under all kinds of deadline concerns, but there actually is a thought process that you hope an individual in a newsroom will go through to reach decisions. The same thing is true as it relates to dealing with the changing demographics inside communities. Some of it is responding to the numbers. Some of it is responding to natural stories. But a lot of it is dealing with these issues at a level of thinking that goes beyond the norm. And I think training addresses that. One last note on this issue of the internet in trying to project where we are. I think the internet is a pivot point of training inside our traditional newsrooms. And I don't have a clue when print stops and something else begins. I'd like Frank thinking that it's going to be longer than the hype of a few years indicated. But in some sense, there is an irrelevance to that time frame as long as we capture the kinds of points that you were making, that people need information. And there's nothing about the future of humanity that says that will change. The form will depend, and that will depend on the audience. And I actually don't see a long-term picture in which we lose that classified ad that you talked about. Perhaps it's not in print, but it's in another place, perhaps online. Part of what you sell as a newspaper is not just the news, the tangible stories that you can touch. You sell an environment. You sell an understanding. You sell an image. And the public is really pretty fickle about this in some ways, because on the one hand, we get bashed for not being good enough. And you know what? In many cases, the public is right. At the same time, there is a grudging level of, and you pick the word, respect on some level, dependability on some level.
Or dependence.
Yes.
Look, You know, in the last 5 minutes or so, we've listened to some poetic language about the state of journalism and projecting ahead, and even in economic terms. From this book that we all have memorized called Newsroom Training that the Knight Foundation put out, Haynes Johnson, who's a pretty good reporter, right? He's been around a while. His judgment is the following: there can be no doubt, he says, page 46, that increasing numbers of Americans view the performance of the news media not just with misgiving, but with deepening distrust and even disgust. I think that's pretty tough language from a guy who loves journalism. And I wonder if Haynes is right, and I suspect he is. What gives you the confidence to produce the poetry that all is going to be so wonderful in 5 years, when it may very well, if Haynes is right, you may be dead wrong on your projections, and all of the training that you're doing may not end up producing what it is that you'd like? Richard.
It's all his fault. It's all that internet.
I mean, it's all those people. I understand that, but you're a good, very good reporter. You cover wars, you cover politics. You've done it all. You've listened to a lot of this talk. What do you think? How does it come through your filter?
Coming at it from another level, general assignment reporter, dinosaur. And a lot of this has been above my pay grade. You know, what it comes down to, internet, pencil and paper, however it comes out and whatever the product is, there has to be some kind of holy smokes factor that is retained among us all. What Caesar was talking about, you know, the fragmentation of communities and insularity of communities. And all of us, you know, particularly my paper, losing a lot of circulation to special interest newspapers, be it Spanish newspapers, Haitian newspapers, and so on. Somehow we have to come up with this general product for the general interest reader, done by general assignment reporters, that's going to be solid and tell them what's going on in their world, in their community. And the idea of, you know, Mr. Johnson's quote there, mistrust and hatred and
disgust.
Yeah, it's baffling, and when you're out there, you can feel it. There's, you know, you go out to something, you know, be it whatever it is, a disaster, a political rally, something like this, and you know, you feel it among people, and sometimes they express it to you, and sometimes they express it to you physically. That happens. And I'm not quite sure where it comes from. You hear them on C-SPAN in the morning, these Area 51 people calling up, you know, this, that, and the other thing. And wow, is that who we're writing for?
My sort of concluding question, or the theme that I would like us to discuss, is there are a lot of people in this audience, and there are people whom those of us who teach about journalism, and there are aspiring journalists around. And my question is a simple one: how do aspiring journalists prepare to work in this new economic environment, this new sociological environment that you're describing? Mm-hmm. What is it that journalists ought to do to prepare? Should they learn a great deal of economics? Should they learn languages? Is that really what you're getting at? Or when you use words like skill, and then Barbara talks about ways of writing, that you become a better writer, do you really think that if somebody's a journalist for 15, 20 years and you're going to take him or her out and say you're going to be a better writer now, if they're not a better writer by that time, they're never going to be? I mean, seriously, what do you tell these aspiring journalists?
Well, you know, where they are, if they're in undergraduate school, I mean, they need to learn as much outside of journalism classes as they possibly can. I mean, all accredited journalism schools require their students to take 75% of their courses outside of the journalism department, and I think that's a terrific thing, to study history, political science, geography, there's a novel idea, mathematics, you know, all of these things that, that journalists can sometimes be a little weak on. But there's also a place for studying the craft, and to my mind, learning to report and learning to write and learning to exercise critical thinking, to be intellectually curious about the world around you, are the fundamental underpinnings of any intellectual undertaking, even journalism.
We've only got a couple of minutes. Help out our aspiring journalists, Frank.
The thing that's missing from journalism school that I see, and I've gone to 2 or 3 of them successfully, graduated, is that we don't have enough professionals and professors in journalism schools pounding the table and telling students that there is no better way to spend your life than doing journalism. You know, I went into it thinking it was a vow of poverty. I remember going to Europe as a senior in college saying that I would never go overseas again because I wouldn't be able to afford it. Fortunately, that's not been the case. But there's no other profession where you can go out, day one out of school, go out, back the governor against the wall, get the truth, put it in the newspaper, raise hell, and save the world. And I've been doing it in small ways and medium ways throughout my career, as have Caesar and Barbara and the other journalists up here, and it is just wonderful. There's no better way to spend your life than doing journalism.
Chris, you got 30 seconds.
Wouldn't add anything to what these folks have done right here.
Absolutely terrific. In that case, I want to thank our terrific panel for really helping us and enlightening us, giving us some food for thought. I want to thank the co-sponsors of the Kalb Report, the George Washington University, the National Press Club, and the Shorenstein Center at Harvard. And I want once again to thank the Knight Foundation for funding the Kalb Report and for making this series and these discussions possible. So thank you all once again. I'm Marvin Kalb. Good night and good luck.